again. Okay, so today this is going to probably be my last COVID farce video. I might do a summary. Um, but I'm talking about anti-vax. Because that's become the big thing going on. People want to talk about it and not knowing what they're talking about when they do talk about it. Now, I'm willing to bet, well, if you took high school biology, odds are you've seen the 1802 political cartoon or comic strip or whatever you want to call it about inoculation and smallpox, giving the cowpox shot for it. And so they had people getting the shot and little cows popping out of their bodies and stuff like that. Like I said, if you've taken high school biology, you've probably seen this cartoon. And of course, it wouldn't surprise me if you've seen it pop up over the past 2 or 3 years when the COVID vaccine came up, because it's a great propaganda tool to lie about what other people are thinking. Because the people who used it were lying about what the anti-vax people were thinking. And we've already talked about this once, I mentioned, making Trumper and anti-vaxxer synonyms was completely wrong because Trump backed up the vaccines and he encouraged people to get them. So Trump's followers, who are blindly doing whatever he says, would all be getting the vaccine and not be anti-vax. But again, a lot of politics went into this, and so, politicians lie. And the same goes with this whole, trying to equate the people in the 1800s, early 1800s, being against the smallpox vaccine with the people in the late or the recent 21st century being against the COVID so-called vaccines isn't the same thing. So let's jump back and look at a little history. Smallpox used to be known as la variole. And so a process known as variolation came out, named after la variole. And that's basically, it was an early inoculation attempts, various amounts of success. History of this, again, you'd have to read a lot of in-depth stuff, which I read a few articles on it. I didn't go into any in-depth, history books on it. This goes back as early as 200 BC, according to some web pages I found. People were writing about it in the 1100s, so we know it was being used then. Like I said earlier, there might be a vague reference to something which sounds like a treatment for smallpox or... So, I've seen possibly as early as 200 because, again, we're looking at texts which aren't really going into detail. So, the historians reading the texts are saying, well, was this actually a smallpox treatment or was this something else? Now, what they would do in the early days, so 1100s, I'd say that's probably was being practiced more widely in Europe. Because, but we know it was being practiced in other parts of the world. Like I said, one early Chinese method, which I later found out was being used in Europe as well, was they would take poxy material. So basically, a guy gets smallpox. The little blisters break out on his body, scabs break out. They would take the scab material, let it dry out, grind it to a powder, and have people inhale it. And so that was it. And various methods, they do steam, try to get it breathe better. Sometimes you would just sniff it. No great details on how it was done. So the basic principle was people realized no one got smallpox twice, and so they didn't really understand about antibodies or things like that, but they sort of got the idea, well, this guy survived it, so maybe there's something in him that helped him survive it that we can pass on. And so basically, call it what you want, magic, call it voodoo, call it whatever, but they sort of believe this guy survived it, maybe we can, whatever, however he survived it, we can pass it on. So basically they were purposely infecting people with smallpox, and they knew the guy who's breathing this stuff's probably going to get smallpox. According to one paper I read, there was only a 2 to 3% death rate from people who got the variolation treatment, which was better than the death rate of people who didn't. So apparently it worked. They didn't know why it worked. They were doing it. Now, according to one paper, Great Britain didn't start until 1721. Other papers I read said that the United States started in 1721, which sounded a little coincidental. More likely, it started in Britain earlier than that, and the guy who said that it started in 1721 just had his facts wrong, or was, read the wrong article, because we were still colonies then, so he might have assumed, or could have been because we were colonies, that it was the same. I'm not sure. Like I said, I only saw one paper that said Great Britain started in 1721. I saw several that said the United States started, or the U.S. colonies, to be more precise. Up at this time, they were basically, instead of inhaling it, they were jabbing people's, you get the disease, you get blisters and scabs or whatever, so they were jabbing people's scabs with the needles, getting the pus on them, and then poking other people with it. Which, again, it was working. Now, here's where things start to get strange, because, again, I worked in the health and safety field. If I were to suggest doing this today, I'd be kicked out as a medical person. No one would, because we got all these bloodborne pathogens. You don't poke someone with a needle, then poke someone else with the same needle, because you'll spread all sorts of bloodborne pathogens. So this common practice, which there was basically the forerunner to inoculation, or it was called inoculation at the time. It was the forerunner to vaccination, because vaccination is slightly different. If they were to do it today, you'd lose your medical license, because you might be spreading bloodborne pathogens. Which it's a reasonable concern, but at the same time, if someone, people doing it back in the 1700s, they'd get a little, make that complaint in the 1700s, and you'd get a little cartoon about cows popping out of your arm based on it. So, like I said, the people who are using the old cartoon for modern day, pro-vaccine arguments don't really know the facts of what was going on at the time. And they don't really know the facts about, modern medical practices to old medical practices. Because, again, we would have never done variolation with a needle the way they did it in the early 1700s. Now, George Washington mandated it, and they were doing this, and it was almost a disaster, because while the idea was good, they weren't quarantining people, because the idea was to give someone the disease, hope it was sort of a weaker form, hope you were giving them antibodies or whatever they would have, whatever kind of immunity they would have thought existed. They didn't consider the fact that the people getting the disease could still spread it. So they weren't quarantining, They almost had an outbreak of regular smallpox because, sure, I've gotten this weakened form injected into me, but when I go home, I can spread a full strength form to my family. In fact, I saw one or two papers which said if the British had known we were doing this, they could have won the Revolutionary War. Because at one point, we had so many soldiers sick with smallpox that they could have just overrun us. So again, it worked. Technically, it worked, but the practice, the implementation was bad. And so it could have been a bigger disaster just because we took a good idea and did it poorly. Now we jump up to, when was that? 1796. Edward Jenner, he makes the smallpox vaccine out of cowpox. He tests it on a boy named James Phipps. Which again, modern day, we're just going to experiment on kids with these things. This wouldn't have flown very well. A lot of people would have gotten sued, even sued. Even if the vaccine worked, it would be like, you're testing this on children, we're going to sue you. But he did it. He published 2 years later in 1798 that it worked. And so they started, let's encourage people to get vaccinated. And this is, a few years later, 1802, they came out with this cartoon with the cows popping out of people's bodies. Now again, this time around, what we were saying was, we want to protect you from one disease by giving you a second one. Sort of, your computer's got a virus, let me download another virus to take care of it. Which is, sort of what anti-vax virus software's sort of the same thing, only we don't call them viruses because they don't replicate and they don't destroy systems and stuff like that. Whereas with the cowpox, smallpox, humans could get cowpox. It wasn't as often. People could, you got sick from it. So we're going to cure one disease by giving you another disease. Now it was called cowpox because it was more common among cows than among humans, although humans could get it. And so that was the big thing with the cartoon with the little cows popping out. People weren't complaining about being inoculated because variolation had been around for a long time and people have been practicing it. They were complaining about, you're giving us a cow disease, and how is this going to help us? Now, living 225 years later like we do, we laugh at them and say, oh, those ignorant people back then. But that's because we've had generations of people getting vaccinations, and we know how it works, and we're taught how it works, and they worked. So, again, rather than look at it from a biological vaccine, look at it as a computer vaccine, or a computer virus. You got a virus, I'm going to upload another virus, and that'll cure you. And no one would allow me to do that, because why would I want my infected computer to get another virus? And so that was a lot of what was going on. It wasn't that they were against the procedure, they were against the fact that, wait a second, this is another virus, another disease. We also got to understand, germ theory didn't come out until about 1877. Louis Pasteur proposed the germ theory 75 years after the cowpox cartoon came out. So, we're talking about these people were ignorant. Literally, science was ignorant at the time. They had no clue. This was, in a way, it was a lot of guesswork going into it. Okay, let's jump forward into time. 1990s, early 2000s, there was another big anti-vaccination campaign going on. And basically we had outbreaks of ADD among kids and ADHD and all these diseases which kids didn't have before. And some people say, well, those always existed, and other people say, well, yeah, but it wasn't hyperactivity so much as their children. They just need to run out and play sometimes, and you're expecting them to sit at home, or worse yet, you're giving them a computer to sit in front of instead of letting them run and play. So of course they've got a bunch of excess energy and don't know what to do with it. And some people studied the new vaccines that were coming out and being given to children and said, wait a second, some of these have some nasty chemicals in them. Forget what it's called. Formaldehyde. And it really wasn't a part of the vaccine itself so much as the serum that the vaccine was carried in contained formaldehyde. And you go online and you look up the safety data sheet for formaldehyde and you say, hey, this is horrible stuff. And it is. Formaldehyde is dangerous stuff in pure form. Now, you go online and look up the safety data sheet, and you're going to find 5 or 6 different ones, depending on the company you're looking at. And some of them will have full-strength formaldehyde, which is dangerous stuff. Some will have 20% solution. Some will have 50% solution. And so, as you mix formaldehyde with other stuff, it becomes less dangerous. Although there can still be problems with it, but it's not as scary. And so the people looking up the stuff, they didn't necessarily find the right safety data sheet when they made their complaints, which isn't a problem because, see, scientists don't know how to read safety data sheets either. Again, worked in lab safety for a long time. A lot of scientists think it's beneath their dignity to read a safety data sheet. I'll just use standard practices, lab gloves and a lab coat and gloves, and I'll be fine. And they are fine until they spill the stuff and they don't know how to clean it up or something like that. So all these housewives and parents who, they're doing the best they can with the information they can get from the internet, they're really not any more wrong than the scientists they're told to believe in, because the scientists don't read the safety data sheets either. A lot of them don't know how to. Some of them do, but even then, the idea that looking up the 20% solution versus the 50% solution, scientists don't even think of that at times. So you really can't criticize the parents because they're really doing what the scientists do too, and that is misapplying stuff at times. So then we jump forward to the COVID vaccines, and now most people who are labeled as anti-vax aren't really anti-vax. A lot of them got vaccinated. The problem is a lot of people are against vaccination mandates. And they did to some extent. To some extent, they existed. People could force other people to under the right circumstances. There was no nationwide mandate, but other people were forced to get them, or forced to make a choice of get them or lose your job. Now I keep referring to them as so-called vaccines because, again, they changed the definition of vaccine to fit these things. It makes sense after 200 years of knowing what a vaccine is and studying high school biology and learning, okay, we give someone a weakened form of the disease and their system can learn to fight it off and build antibodies, and then they'll be immune to the full strength version. As opposed to, we're going to take this mRNA, messenger recombinant deoxyribonucleic acid, which is actually dangerous stuff to be working with, and we're just going to insert it into you. But it was about 20 years ago we finished the Human Genome Project. And it was going to do all sorts of modern miracles for us. And in reality, it was just it's a reference chart. It's not going to solve any problems of and by itself like some people said it was. It's just a reference chart to make things easier. But it's a very complex reference chart. And so even having the human genome mapped out doesn't necessarily mean, oh, we can just start genetic manipulation. Again, mRNA, part of its purpose is to rewrite genetic code. So yeah, I'm a little worried about this stuff that, we rushed through because, again, we had the horse dewormer, which people made fun of that in the same way that people back 200 years ago made fun of inoculation. The smallpox vaccine. If you look at the arguments, they're pretty much the same. So we had it. It worked. We've got enough reason to believe that it worked. But we're going to deny that it works in order to fast track these so-called vaccines through, which when they released the vaccines, they admitted these don't really work as vaccines. They just hide the symptoms or mask the symptoms. And you can get it if you want, but if you question mandating it, we're going to claim that you're against them completely, whether you got it or not. Then we came out with the long COVID, which was actually talked about before there were vaccines. It's just not very. It wasn't a big deal as much. I overheard conversations, people talking about you can get COVID and 10 years from now it'll relapse and come back, which isn't really what long COVID is. If you look up the CDC website, long COVID, it just lasts longer than normal COVID. And it's basically you have a pre-existing health condition usually. You get long COVID and these symptoms are more severe and it lasts longer, basically. And the idea that it's going to relapse 10 years from now isn't really a thing. If you read the CDC site, it says you can always recatch COVID. It's always possible to recatch COVID. The more often you do it, the more likely you are to suffer from long COVID. And it's just because it's not the COVID you had 2 years ago springing up suddenly. It's you got COVID and your body still hasn't adjusted completely from the last time you got it. I don't know. But you get it a second time, and this time it's worse. That's what long COVID really is. It's not you got COVID 5 years ago and it's going to reassert itself. But that's what people were saying. You got to get vaccinated or you'll get long COVID. Well, no, because A, the vaccine doesn't prevent you from getting the disease. It just lessens the symptoms, which of a sort, long COVID is more severe symptoms, so it sort of works that way, but it doesn't mean that the next time you get the disease, you won't get the long COVID, because, of course, you have to keep getting your boosters. So you keep getting your boosters and you're protected against long COVID, but when we stop coming out with new boosters, which eventually we're going to, yes, natural immunity or natural inoculation would be a better thing. If you can make a vaccine for something, then the old vaccines were a weakened form of the disease, gives you a weakened form of it, your body builds antibodies. If that works, then you would think having the disease full strength and surviving, your body would have antibodies. It would make sense. Anything we can develop an artificial vaccine for, you should be able to do, natural, anyone who survives it should be immune to it. Smallpox. That's how variolation got started. We found out people didn't get smallpox twice, so we thought, okay, maybe if we were to purposely give it to them, then under controlled circumstances or whatever. We got what is it, chickenpox parties. We do the same thing. The idea being people can only get it once. So, COVID vaccine, why not believe the same thing? Either you get it once, you get over it, and you can't get it again, or you get a vaccine because the vaccine, that proves that a vaccine can exist, sort of. That's the way it's explained to us when we grow up. And so there's a lot more to it, yes, but it makes sense people to believe this stuff because that's what the schools taught us when we were growing up. And that's why people want to disbelieve the government when they turn around and say, no, 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 we got this new thing here, and everything we taught you, everything your tax dollars paid to teach your children was wrong. We don't want to hear that. And so the idea that I can get the COVID vaccine or I can get the disease itself, and either way I should be immune to it later, makes sense. But we have different strains. Well, different strains can affect the vaccine as well. That's why we repeat the flu vaccine every year. We can, because there are different strains of the flu. And so saying, being vaccinated isn't going to protect you from the strain of COVID that comes next year. But again, as I pointed out, as the manufacturers of the so-called vaccines have pointed out, they don't really protect you. They just lessen the symptoms. So they aren't really vaccines as we think of them. So we are actually more justified in doubting the COVID vaccines because we've been told they don't work than the people were back in the early 1800s to doubt the smallpox vaccine. So again, pulling out this old cartoon and saying, these anti-vaxxers today, they're as bad as these people were 200 years ago. No, actually, we're smarter than the people were 200 years ago. I just proved it. Have a nice day.